Hello and welcome to this video of Inside Stream. Today is 16th of August 2025 and this is my second video of the day. In the previous video I discussed the developing frontline situation in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. Now in this video I will be briefly visiting the the summit that took place between President Trump and Vladimir Putin. Now, President Putin arrived on 15th of August 2025 in Russia, in America, Anchorage, Alaska. Now, if we start from the very beginning, President Trump and President Putin got out of the planes simultaneously. President Trump walked ahead and received Mr. Putin, and the meeting was friendly. They received each other, they greeted each other in a very friendly manner. Later on, they both walked cars in which they were supposed to go to the meeting place. But President Trump invited Mr. Putin to go in his own car. Naturally, must have talked, discussed the manner in which the meeting was to be conducted, the topics which are to be discussed, and perhaps there must have been even some personal discussions on how both the leaders intend to approach this particular summit. Now, if you look at the meeting that was conducted, there were several statements that were issued after the meeting was over. President Trump and President Putin conducted a joint press conference after the meeting which lasted for more than 3 hours. And it seems to be a good sign, as any meeting which lasts for 3 hours and then there is a joint summit between the participants tends to give a positive message to almost all the parties that are involved in this particular meeting. Now, if you look at the statements that were issued, President Trump rated this particular meeting as a 10 out of 10, which seems that he is very pleased with the outcome of the meeting. Now, in this particular meeting, no questions were taken from the reporters, only statements were issued by both the national leaders. Now, moving on to the statement that was issued by President Putin in this particular meeting, one of the opening statements that President Putin said was that for Russia, for there to be peace, all of the Russian legitimate security concerns must be addressed, and a fair balance in the security sphere of Europe and the world as a whole must be established. He also agreed to and also accepted the Ukrainian concerns for security, and he seems to be willing to accept security guarantees for Ukraine. The only concern that he has expressed that the security guarantees must not come from NATO or any of the NATO members, perhaps third parties which are acceptable to both the Russian and the American side. Now, President Putin further stated that we expect that Kiev and the European capitals will perceive this meeting in a constructive way and won't create obstacles in an attempt to disrupt the emerging process through provocations behind the scenes. Now, the Russian government has been concerned with the attitude of the European capitals and as well as Kiev regarding the peace processes. Europeans have been insisting on a ceasefire before any agreements. Further, the French and the Germans and even the British have been talking about sending peacekeepers from their own militaries in order to enforce ceasefire between these two nations, obviously favoring the Ukrainians. One of the most notable statements that was issued from President Putin was that for Russia, the events in Ukraine are connected with the fundamental threats to our own national security. Now, this particular statement was a reference to President Putin to the expansion of NATO in the Eastern European region, specifically addressing the 2008 NATO Bucharest summit, where the decision was taken, a disastrous decision was taken by the NATO allies to invite Ukraine to apply for membership in NATO, and this is where this entire crisis starts. In the year 2014, there was a crisis, a border crisis, where the Russian and the Ukrainian forces started a fight. Germany imposed sanctions along with rest of the European nations. Later on, when the sanctions failed to work, Angela Merkel visited Russia, and in a private meeting that took place between Angela Merkel and Vladimir Putin, some agreements were reached. The contents of the meeting are entirely confidential, and no statement had been issued by either of these two leaders previously. But the legitimate concerns of Russia have always been that any European influence in the eastern region, my apologies, on the western borders of Russia is simply unacceptable, and Ukraine being invited to become a NATO member is a legitimate concern of the Russian nation, and therefore the Russians have been very forward with their demands that Ukraine must not become a member of NATO. Putin further stated that the outcome of the war must be permanent. In other words, he intends and he states that temporary ceasefires are not a solution to this particular problem. A permanent solution is definitely required, and that the Russians are not willing to compromise on their position even the slightest. No ceasefire has been agreed on land or air or the sea. Further, a freeze of the conflict has been ruled out entirely. A ceasefire, a freeze of the conflict is entirely out of the question. This was the outcome, in short, a brief outcome which I have concluded from what I have read and heard on the social media and various press statements that have been issued by both the sides. President Trump has been invited by President Putin for the next round of the meeting, which is likely to be held in the month of September. Now, President Putin, speaking in English, he invited President Trump to Moscow, to which President Trump responded that he will be receiving some heat for this particular visit, and he may even be discouraged by his own party members and the various members of the US government. But at the same time, he also said that he does see it happening, and it is very likely that it will happen. So that is all for the conclusion that I have derived from this Russian-American summit. In the next video, I will be discussing about the European response and the European attitude to this particular summit. That is all for this particular video. Thank you.